Hi, we come to the last judgment scene at the end of Revelation 20, and as we begin, I'd like us to listen to the passage as we watch an array of artistic representations of this incredible scene from the 15th century to the 20th. Then I saw a great white throne and the one who sat on it. The earth and the heaven fled from his presence, and no place was found for them. And I saw the dead, great and small, standing before the throne, and books were opened. Also another book was opened, the book of life. And the dead were judged according to their works as recorded in the books. And the sea gave up the dead that were in it. Death and Hades gave up the dead that were in them, and all were judged according to what they had done. Then death and Hades were thrown into the lake of fire. This is the second death, the lake of fire. And anyone whose name was not found written in the book of life was thrown into the lake of fire. So I'm sure you recognized amidst those, almost right at the middle, wasn't meant to be a chiasm, but just in terms of chronological order, the great Sistine Chapel painting of Michelangelo. As a parenthetical, I'm not sure how they got this image because I've been to the Sistine Chapel and you're not allowed to take pictures in there. So somebody's got a picture of it, but you can't go take one yourself. But as you can see from the Fra Angelico image from the 1430s all the way through the Vasari image in 1579, the medieval social understanding really shaped the images we see here. The hierarchy from above to below, and then the great separation on one side of those going to the lake of fire, and the other side those going to their reward with God. It's not until later, to the image of John Martin in 1851, and in the 20th century expressionism of Kandinsky, that we see people grappling with it otherwise. In addition, I didn't want to take too much time on this because this is a series about the words in the story and not about art, but no image from Revelation that I've looked up has had more visions in art than this one. Not even the Four Horsemen or the Beast or any of the things that we might think are the classic images from Revelation. My image search from Wikimedia have filled an entire screen and scroll down more with the dozens and dozens of images that people have painted to try to express in vision what John's vision expresses in words. So we're going to look at the words today, but perhaps you can have those visions and what inspired them in mind as we go. So it begins when I saw a great white throne, and we recall that continues the parallels from chapter 19 through the chapter 20, verse 4, that both end with the throne vision. This time a great white throne, though, and that's the first time we're seeing a great white throne. As Auni notes, the image of a great throne could perhaps come from the Canaanite tradition of a great throne for Baal from Isaiah 6, also for Yahweh from Isaiah 6:1. It's certainly more likely that John is getting his context from Isaiah than it is from Canaanite traditions, which have been long before his time. And it's also described as a white throne. It's only here in the Bible that we see a white throne, although we've seen bright thrones earlier. And notice the unnamed one who sat on it. We can presume that's God, although we've seen earlier that God and the Lamb both sit on the throne together. And so it doesn't say they, it's the one. So some scholars want to argue it's the Lamb. There's obviously no basis for making a distinction here, but God or the Lamb are there. And the response is odd and perhaps startling. The earth and the heaven fled from his presence, and no place was found for them. There's at least two ways to interpret this. As Montague says in my note below, this must stand not for the beautiful creation that once came from God's hand, nor even for their transitory nature, but for the religio-political order of the cosmos opposed to his purpose. It is the chaotic world constructed by human sinfulness and oppressive human structures. In other words, what I've been calling empire. And there's evidence to support that. We've seen throughout that the phrase inhabitants of the earth meant people who were devoted to empire. It's more difficult to equate that around heaven, though, because heaven has been the place of God's presence. And we've certainly seen angels with messages for John coming from there. So that's one way to read it. Another way to read it is it's simply the creation leaving to make room for the new heaven and the new earth. Notice there's a singular here in fled. They're fleeing collectively. So that's another way to read this, is that they're gone. And that would be one of the echoes we hear from Isaiah 51 here in our Hebrew scripture echoes. Lift up your eyes to the heavens and look at the earth below, for the heavens will vanish like smoke. The earth will wear out like a garment, and those who live on it will die like gnats. But my salvation shall be forever, and my deliverance will never be ended. Of course, in the Isaiah passage, it's hypothetical. It's simply to say that God is eternal, and eventually the earth and the heavens are not eternal and will wear out. And that's not the image here in Revelation 20:11 that they're wearing out. It's that they're running away. And perhaps that's to highlight that we're going to see God's power on this throne isolated from creation, just in its pure glory and power, and the creation isn't a part of this right now. So we can interpret that either way we want, as metaphorical for the social structure of empire or of the moving out of creation for a new creation. And no place was found for them, echoing, as I have this up here, directly verbatim from Daniel and the Septuagint Theodotion version. No place is found for them here, and we've seen place a number of times in Revelation. It's hard to know where you would go if you're heaven and earth and there's no place for them. But then the image shifts. So it starts from the throne, and then it shifts to the image of the dead, and then it's going to and books, and it's going to shift to death and Hades. So let's look carefully at verse 12. There's a lot going on here. We can see this in comparison with Daniel 7:10 that we see here. The court sat in judgment, and the books were opened, and we see that image taken up in other apocalyptic literature outside the Bible, like in 4th Ezra and also in 1st Enoch. So a wide tradition of apocalyptic literature of that. And we'll see where some of the root is from within the Bible. And I saw the dead here, a unitary image of resurrection, as in 1st Enoch 51 that you see down here on the side, that from Bauckham. And he suggests this is the second resurrection. When we looked at the passage earlier, when there was first resurrection, I said I have no idea what that meant in distinction. Perhaps this is the second resurrection, just as it will be named the second death for those who are judged negatively in a minute. So you can decide that for yourself. I saw the dead, great and small, which is to say all of them, standing before the throne, and books were opened. Notice the chronological problem we have here if we try to take Revelation as a sequence of events. Because it's not until verse 13 that the sea gave up the dead that were in it, and death and Hades gave up the dead that were in it. So here they're described as standing before the throne, whereas in verse 13 they had otherwise been captives of death and Hades in the sea. So again, we can't read this as chronological. John is seeing these things in God's time where they're simultaneous. So he saw the dead, small and great, standing before the throne, and that's where we saw folks back in chapter 6 who are killed for their witness and to Jesus, calling out for justice and then celebrating when the promise of justice is to come. Standing before the throne, and books were opened. Notice they're unnamed books. So we're going to look at books more closely in a minute, but from my note below, you can see that 23 out of the 34 uses of biblia or biblion, the singular, in the New Testament are in Revelation. There's at least two books involved here, one of the deeds of humans and then the book of life. But it's more complicated than that. So let's finish the paragraph and then we'll look at something, or the verse, and we'll look at something about books. So also another book was opened. So here it's a plural books were opened, and then there's another book, the book of life. So there have to be at least three books described here. The book of life is not directly found anywhere in the Hebrew scripture. It's only one other time in the Bible, and that's in Philippians 4:3. But no other place, although it's mentioned a number of times, and we'll see that in Revelation in just a moment. And the dead were judged according to their works, as recorded, or literally as written in the books. How do we relate this together? So let's look at a couple of things about books. So one thing that may mislead us is two of the biblia in Revelation are described in most translations as scrolls. The scroll that is sealed with 7 seals back in chapter 5, and the little scroll that's open in the hand of the angel that John is told to eat in chapter 10. And there's the metaphor of a scroll in 6:14. I've color-coded these in terms of a couple of categories. Purple is referring to the book itself of Revelation. So in the very beginning is right in the book what you see, and at the end we see repeated a number of times, this book, this book, this book, this book, trying to protect the book from change. It's sort of like a copyright warning at the end. So you write in a book what you see is the command, and now the book has been written. And then in the green is the references to the two major scrolls that are described as scrolls and not as books. And then the blue here, as you can see, are references to the book of life. And notice how many more of those there are. This is a little misleading because there are 7 uses of biblion here in chapter 5, verses 1 to 9. But here spread out across 8 chapters, from chapter 13 to 17 to 20 to 21, are references to the book of life. Here described as the Lamb's book of life, or here the book of life of the Lamb that was slaughtered. And notice the sequence we see. So the negative ones at first. Everyone whose name has not been written from the foundation of the world in the book of life. and again, whose names have not been written in the book of life. Notice both times that's describing the inhabitants of the earth, reinforcing the idea that the earth fleeing here is not the physical earth, but the earth that's identified with empire. And then more neutrally in our passage right now, another book was opened, the book of life, and then they're judged according to each direction. Then one more in our passage, those whose names are not found in the book of life are thrown into the lake of fire, which is to say these people up here. But then those who are written in the book of life will enter into New Jerusalem in chapter 21. So a number of uses of that, and we have to look at what that's playing out over against, especially biblically and especially imperially. So let's look at named books in the Bible. I don't mean Genesis, Exodus, which are not named in the Bible. They're named by editors of the Bible in the modern world, but the book of Genesis is never called the book of Genesis inside itself. That's a label that comes from outside. Just like the Gospels aren't called the Gospel of Mark or the Gospel of Matthew, etc., inside themselves either. So books that are named in the Hebrew Scriptures, and this is how many there are in the order of appearance, starting from Exodus moving forward. And I just gave some examples because a number of these are used a number of times. The ones in red I put as in quotes secular, because nothing in the Bible is really secular. Certainly it implies that these kings have God's approval, but they're primarily the acts of royalty, as you'd see parallels across many different cultural contexts where empires keep records of the acts of their kings that they want to glorify for future generations. But the blue ones are ones that refer to God's authority. So the covenant, the wars of Yahweh, the law or Torah, described a number of times as the Torah of Moses, the Torah of Yahweh, the Torah of God. But then we get to what's relevant for us here. The book of the living from Psalm 69. The book of Jeremiah's prophecies, which I want to bring up for another reason in a moment. The book of truth, the book of the vision of Nahum, and the book of remembrance. Though what's really important for our purpose is the book of the genealogy of the exiles in Nehemiah 7:5. What we need to see here is how books have been used by empires to decide who's in and who's out, and that what we're seeing in Revelation 20 is the parody of that, that God is the ultimate king, the King of Kings as he's been described, has the ultimate book to decide who's in and out. It challenges both Rome's book or other empires' books, but also the books within the Bible. So let's look at one example of that from the time of exile. So we hear this from 1 Chronicles 9. So all Israel was enrolled by genealogies, and these are written in the book of the kings of Israel. And Judah was taken into exile in Babylon because of their unfaithfulness. So the author of Chronicles there is highlighting that everybody who's gone into exile is named on a list of the book of the kings of Israel, which you can see on my chart there. But in the book of Nehemiah, which is after exile, after the Persians come to allow the restoration of Jerusalem, we hear this. The voice of Nehemiah speaking. Then my God put it into my mind to assemble the nobles and the officials and the people to be enrolled by genealogy. And I found the book of the genealogy of those who were the first to come back, and I found the following written in it. These are the people of the province who came up out of the captivity of those exiles, whom King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon had carried into exile. They returned to Jerusalem and Judah, each to his town. And that becomes the basis by which Nehemiah, the Persian designated governor of the province of Yehud, decides who are the citizens. So it's much like an official government list that decides you're on the citizenship list and therefore you're in. And that was part of a process in Ezra and Nehemiah that excluded even those who were on the list who had been married to foreign women and had foreign children, unless they got rid of those children and their foreign wives. So a very specific list of people who met certain criteria. Whereas what we'll see in Revelation is judged according to their works, and their works are not a matter of marrying foreign women, as we've seen. Their works are a matter of worshiping the true God and not having the mark of the beast, etc. So the books that we're seeing here are parodies of that. So what do we make out of what's actually being said theologically here? It says the first books were opened, and then another book was opened, the book of life, and the dead were judged according to their works as recorded in the books, plural. Certainly, it doesn't seem that their works are recorded in the book of life. And as we see from the uses of book of life earlier in Revelation, we see back in the first reference in 13:8, everyone whose name has not been written from the foundation of the world in the book of life. That leads some scholars to see some conflict here between, if you want to call it this, works righteousness versus righteousness by grace, or salvation by grace, which is to say to impose the Lutheran Reformation argument onto the book of Revelation. And certainly Craig Kester, who's a good Lutheran scholar, comes up with the conclusion, whether Luther would like it or not, decides that the book of life suggests that people are ultimately saved by grace because God has put their names on the list from the beginning, independent of the works they've done. That's one way to read it, but it doesn't have to be read that way. We can read the idea that everyone whose name has not been written from the foundation of the world is, like everything else we've seen in Revelation, an expression that God is not limited as we are to experience time and sequence. In other words, God knows from the beginning who will choose to act according to God's way. So it's not a matter of predestination, like God has picked some people before they were born and then protects them from evil and makes them not sin. That would be to make them not human and take away their free will and make them into mechanical puppets. Instead, it's a matter of God knowing, just like God knows that empires fall, quote unquote, before they do, the before being our limited perspective, God knows who's going to side with God and choose God's way from the beginning. So I don't think we need to see any conflict here. The text is very explicit that people are judged according to their works, and that's what we've seen throughout. So it's not new here, and it's just consistent with that those who do good works have their names written from the beginning in the book of life. And so we continue into this interesting image here, and this evokes a number of elements about what people think happens when you die. And I really want to underscore here that Revelation is not giving factual description or predictions. It's giving metaphorical imagery to express something. And so the fact that death and Hades are personified here, which is not something, death is not part of God's creation in the Hebrew Bible, is something that's coming from either a different tradition or just from his imagination, but it's certainly not a fact. So let's look at this verse in a little bit of detail here. As my note below says, the idea of giving up the dead from the place of the dead is probably an adaptation of an apocalyptic tradition found in many contemporary texts, such as 1 Enoch 51 and 4 Ezra, which we can see from the references that we have back here. And that may well be. Notice the distinction between the sea giving up their dead and death and Hades. Are these different things, or is the sea another way of talking about that? A number of scholars suggest that the sea is simply another way of talking about death, as Bauckham says here, another synonym for Sheol. And a number of these passages, I won't show you in detail, have imagery of waves or sequences. And it may be that, but certainly not everybody dies at sea. And why would people who didn't die at sea be understood as being contained within sea? And why make this distinction here? It doesn't say the sea, death, and Hades like it would say the serpent, the Satan, and the devil. It has two separate phrases for it and two separate acts. The sea doing it and death and Hades doing it as a pair. So you can read that way, or you can read it as all of creation is giving up the dead, those in the sea and those under the ground. And that's something important that we look at, this phrase death and Hades. We've seen death and Hades a couple of times earlier. As Bauckham notes, Hades, the personified death may well be John's substitute for Abaddon, which we saw here, Abaddon and Hades. They also may represent the Old Testament pair Sheol and Abaddon, though there's also the Old Testament precedent for the pair death and Sheol, as we see in Hosea there. And here's the passage from Hosea, so you can see it for yourself. Shall I ransom them from the power of Sheol? Shall I redeem them from death? O death, where are your plagues? O Sheol, where is your destruction? And we might hear in that the echo into 1 Corinthians 15 when Paul expresses that, although with a different purpose, and we won't get into those details here. But you can see that death and Sheol are paired there. And throughout the Hebrew Bible, Sheol from the Hebrew is translated into Greek in the Septuagint as Hades, almost always, not always. And both of them represent simply the place where people go when they die. This is not hell. I want to make it very clear. You can look on the internet and you can find all kinds of places, I looked and saw, that say Hades is another name for hell. It's simply not so. And it's plainly not so from what we're seeing here, because Hades is a place that people are before they're judged and sent into the lake of fire. So if you want to call something hell, although nothing in the Bible is actually called hell, certainly you can read English translations that have the word hell in them, but whether it's Gehenna, which is another name for the Jerusalem garbage dump, or here Hades, which is simply the underworld where everybody who dies goes, none of those are the sense of hell where evil people are sent with their souls to suffer punishment. So the personification of death and Hades is, say, the final forces that are at work, working against God here. And notice in both cases the phrase gave up or gave. As Bauckham notes, Revelation version of this tradition has dropped the legal metaphor. With this omission, the idea of giving back the dead has receded. So the sea gives the dead. Where they give them to isn't clear. We see them in verse 12 standing around the throne. So perhaps we can suggest they're rising from here, and that's sort of the image you see in some of those earlier Last Judgment scenes where the evil ones are going down into hell or into Hades or into the lake of fire, depending upon the theology of the painter, and the good are rising up to be with God. And so all were judged according to what they had done here, literally according to works as here. So it's not a different phrase here. It's the exact same phrase, according to their works, exactly as verse 12. So then to finish our passage in our chapter in the last judgment here, then death and Hades were thrown into the lake of fire. Which is to say, if death and Hades are thrown into the lake of fire, that ought to be the end of things. But there are multiple options, as there so often are. So let's look at a few of them in my notes down below. Either the death will be annihilated, which we'll see in New Jerusalem in 21:4. There will be no more death, and that's echoed into Paul's vision of 1 Corinthians. The last enemy to be destroyed is death. That physical death will be annihilated. In other words, people will not die anymore. Not just that a force called death will be annihilated, but that people won't die. Or as metonymy, that those held in death and Hades will be permanently removed into the lake of fire, which is say everything in death and Hades. And there's no basis I don't see for making the decision that one of those is quote unquote right or not. But what's clear is these forces that held people are being destroyed, and people are either going into the lake of fire or they're going to be with God. And this is described as the second death, the lake of fire, which is part of what leads to the implication, even though it's not explicit, that the separation here of those who are judged positively and go to God is the second resurrection. So what we're seeing in Revelation is some sense that the people are dead, they're in death and Hades, but some are already around the throne, as we saw back in chapter 6, and then in the end of this final judgment are separated. Again, if we try to get too logical about it, we get into all kinds of knots, so I'm not going to try to do that. And our passage ends with, and anyone whose name was not found written in the book of life was thrown into the lake of fire. And that goes back to one of the questions we've been looking at all along, the various books that were opened, which I've been addressing here. And if all those who are not written in the book of life are thrown in the lake of fire, then who are the people standing outside the gates of New Jerusalem? And the answer is that we can't put this into a sequence. Yes, they're thrown in the lake of fire. When that's happening isn't clear. Is it happening at the moment that John is seeing it, or is it happening eventually? And that's not clear from the grammar. So again, it's partly a sense of it's not about the future, but it's also a sense that Revelation, like so much of the New Testament, is trying to do the both and of God's judgment against evil and against those who have hurt the poor and the marginalized. And so there's justice for those people, the cry that we've heard since chapter 6, but also the sense of mercy. That God has compassion and mercy and continues to give people another chance, just as God gave the people of exile another chance after exile, and the people of Jerusalem another chance after Jerusalem was destroyed. So John, not writing as a theologian, but as a visionary here, shows us the both and of God's complete judgment, and yet there's always another chance to repent and turn toward the New Jerusalem, which will come down out of heaven as a bride, and that's where we'll go in our next video. See you then. Bye-bye.